Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
There was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when American government workers got so pissed off at the people running things that they called out of work and protested for weeks. They rolled out sleeping bags on marble floors. They brought in drums and vuvuzelas so they could make themselves loud. They chartered buses to bring in nurses and teachers, corrections officers and cops. In the end, their ranks swelled to 100,000, maybe more.
And the amount of time, energy, and resources about to be unleashed on those who supported the attacks against us is going to be enormous.
This was 2011 in Madison, Wisconsin. Like now, a Republican executive had just come to power. Like now, one of the first things he wanted to do was undermine government employees. In the years since, thanks in part to this effort, the Badger State has been called the GOP's laboratory for dismantling democracy. And stick with me for a second, because Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's moves back then, they were different from what Trump is up to today. But there are these similarities. In 2011, protesters were pissed because Governor Walker was attempting to hamstring public sector unions. He was jamming through what he called a budget repair bill, but it was stuffed with rules that were going to cut off collective bargaining and make it difficult to keep state workers unionized at all. Like Trump and his efficiency czar, Elon Musk, Walker made his case in part by claiming he needed to rein in spending, and he demonized government workers in the process. He called out a Madison area bus driver who collected over $150,000 a year due to overtime. He said public sector employees were haves, while taxpayers were have-nots. The governor himself said his bill dismantling union power was like dropping a bomb.
Thank you all for joining us. We are introducing this morning, in about a half an hour officially, the budget repair bill for the remainder of fiscal year 2011. It is important.
He sounds soft-spoken, right? But Governor Walker said he would call out the National Guard if that's what it took to get his bill passed. Peter Rickman was a student organizer at the time, a member of the Teaching Assistants Association at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Right away, he and the other TAs got to work. February 14th was just a few days away, so the first thing they did was deliver hundreds of valentines to the governor, expressing their support for university employees.
I ran into someone who I know and told him, hey, you coming to the thing? He's like, no, I'm not. I mean, do you think it's really going to do anything anyway? And I just thought to myself, I don't know. I'll get back to you about that.
After that, they planned a people's filibuster of the budget repair bill.
I was extremely nervous. I remember walking up the street towards the Capitol thinking, God, what if, 100 people show up, a whimper, not much of a bang. And so this palpable, heavy feeling of anxiety and dread and nervousness sat in me. And so when I was in the Capitol, I got word that people were getting close and said, how does it look? And they were like, looks pretty amazing. We have 2,000 people here. And I was like, wow, really? And I stepped outside the doors of the Capitol, and there were 2,000 people showing up.
This was the beginning of what would become a weeks-long occupation of the state capitol. At the height of it all, there was a children's play area and a medical station inside the building to accommodate the encampment. Striking was against the law, so teachers who wanted to call out sick could get a doctor's note from on-site university physicians.
And I can tell you, for those of us who have been here for the last 2 weeks, we continue to be inspired by your desire to set aside everyday work, to come out and have your voice heard.
Then, like now, Democratic legislators were outnumbered by Republicans and theoretically powerless. But as the occupation started to build, 14 Democratic state senators threaded through the crowds and got into cars. And then they fled the state entirely. Vacating Wisconsin meant the legislature was lacking the super quorum necessary to pass the governor's bill. The legislation was effectively put on ice. I've been thinking a lot about what happened in Wisconsin back in 2011, because here we are, a month into Donald Trump's second term, and what else is there to do? Do-good lawyers are hard at work filing a blizzard of paperwork against one departmental purge after another. It's unclear, though, if any of those lawsuits are doing much to slow things down. In Congress, most Democrats seem wedded to this idea of being the adults in the room, while Republicans seem wedded to Trump. Like a lot of people, I see the president's self-coup, that's what Dahlia Lithwick calls it, and I think, is now the time folks are going to hit the streets? So today, we're going to look back at Wisconsin to see if there's a case for a similar protest now, even a general strike. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. You know, you often hear about red flags that should be avoided, but what if you focused more on looking for green flags in friends and partners? If you're not sure what they look like, therapy can help you identify green flags, actively practice them in your relationships, and embody the green flag energy yourself. Whether you're dating, married, building a friendship, or just working on yourself, it's time to form relationships that love you back. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy affordable and convenient, and it serves over 5 million people worldwide. You can access a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties, and you can switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/whatnext today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/whatnext. This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's smart to always have a few financial goals. And here's a really smart one you can set: earning cash back on what you buy every day. With Discover, you can. Get this. Discover automatically matches all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year. Seriously, all of it. Discover trusts you to make smart decisions. After all, you listen to this podcast. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. Okay, I gotta come clean here. These thoughts about a strike, they're not coming out of nowhere for me. My husband was one of the people fired in the gradual shuttering of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. His dismissal letter came through around 9 o'clock at night, and it was so sloppy that his name and job title weren't filled in. But even if you think, who really needs another government lawyer? I know, I get it. It's worth considering the CFPB's caseload. My husband was suing to claw back excess fees charged to active duty military, and he was targeting financial services companies that prey on folks with low credit scores. Russ Vogt, who's the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and the CFPB, he's spoken openly of wanting to put federal workers in trauma.
We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. We want when they
This
wake
is
up in the
him
morning,
speaking in 2023 to a pro-Trump think tank.
we want when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding.
I can tell you from personal experience, Russ Vought has gotten his wish. But these workers, they're also angry. The real question is whether they're angry enough to pull a Wisconsin. Because in the next few months, there's going to be a tiny point of leverage to lean into, a looming government shutdown. It'll take Democratic votes to fund the government and raise the debt ceiling, which is a reality that's gotten a little lost in Trump's blizzard of executive action. Some have suggested that Democrats simply refuse to work with the GOP at all and send whatever's left of the government workforce home. But given their relatively toothless actions so far, I think Democratic leadership is going to need their spines stiffened to play hardball. That's where the idea of a strike comes in, which, in essence, would be the government sending itself home. Over the last year or so, this podcast has covered protests all around the world that have seemed to actually succeed. These are general strikes led by workers, all of them in smaller countries experiencing democratic struggles. In March of 2023, for example, hundreds of thousands of Israelis pressed pause on regular business in a bid to stop Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from overhauling the country's Supreme Court. All takeoffs from Israel's main airport were halted for several hours. Restaurants closed. The country's largest port stopped working. The country's biggest union, Histadrut, was behind the action. And in the end, Netanyahu blinked, at least temporarily.
Netanyahu tonight forced into a partial concession, agreeing to delay his legislation, at least for now.
Then, back in December, after South Korea's president declared martial law, unions pressed for consequences.
It's pretty chaotic right now here in the halls of the National Assembly.
When an initial effort to impeach the president failed, a strike effort gained steam. The Korean Metal Workers Union called off work at a Kia plant, joining the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions' calls to oust the president. And in the end, the impeachment seems to have succeeded.
It's an extraordinary day here in Seoul, South Korea. The president has been impeached. It's the second attempt to impeach him.
So, could it happen here? And if so, how? I'm going to admit to having a mixed relationship with protest. On the one hand, when I dug up my old calendar from senior year of high school, I had definitely marked the March for Women's Lives on it. I think my dad took me. On the other hand, I still remember my initial reaction to Occupy Wall Street as a young news producer. I rolled my eyes. Occupy started on, of all days, a Saturday, which struck me as goofy as hell. No one is even on Wall Street on a Saturday, I remember telling a colleague. This take didn't really age all that well. My beef has always been with the limits of protest, what marching around can actually achieve. And for a long time, I really didn't have to think about protest. I'm a journalist. I don't do things. I write them down. I note that with a bitter chuckle. But this is why the strikes in Israel and South Korea stood out to me. They weren't performative at all. Unlike, say, the Women's March that greeted Trump in 2017, these worker actions were associated with demands. At its root, what's happening in the United States is about labor. Trump is firing people, or threatening to. Tens of thousands of federal workers, sure. But there are also people who rely on federal grant funding who now are out of work. There are going to be cuts at universities and hospitals that depend on money from places like the National Institutes of Health.
But it's all of the people that are employed by academic medical centers, not just scientists, but it's the security guards, it's the janitors, it's the folks in IT support. You're going to see a lot of job cuts. It's academic.
Every day, there are a few more stories. Catholic Charities in Houston has reportedly fired a quarter of its staff. A research nonprofit in North Carolina is temporarily laying off more than 200 workers. A tree planting organization in New Orleans is worried it's going to need to close its doors.
My boss actually cried on the phone. She said she felt so guilty recruiting me or getting me to, talking me into coming here. I just moved here from Alabama. I took on a significant amount of debt to do so. And I'd only been there for a month. And then, of course, I was terminated. My team, we did so much great work. And over half of our team was cut.
The question is how to bring these workers together. The United States is far bigger geographically than Israel or South Korea, and unions just aren't as baked into our culture as they are in Israel, where Histadrut was fundamental to the founding of the country. Then there's the fact that even if government workers are unionized, and many are, they're prohibited by law from striking. In fact, the Office of Personnel Management can decide that a federal worker who strikes can never have a job with the U.S. government again. Still, there's this energy building. The head of the American Civil Liberties Union just said that if legal efforts to constrain Trump fail, we're going to need to shut down this country. And every time a government agency closes its doors, staff members download Signal so they can chat, and then they hit the streets. Imagine if the government shutdown in March isn't driven by the Democrats. It's driven by the workers. We'll be back after a quick break. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. This process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
When you check out at the pharmacy, you see the journey from idea to medicine, thanks to our intellectual property system, or IP for short. IP safeguards inventions, like a new way to prevent seizures or lower cholesterol. And IP supports competition from other brands, then lower-cost generics, which are 90% of prescriptions filled in the U.S. Innovation, competition, lower costs, thanks to IP. Learn more at phrma.org/IPWorksWonders.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Here's a fun fact. A general strike never got called in Madison back in 2011. Instead, the tens of thousands of workers who showed up at the Capitol were volunteers. Early on, Wisconsin's South Central Federation of Labor, it goes by SCUFFLE for short, they actually went so far as to authorize a general strike, which would have forced employees to stay home, or better yet, join a picket line. They didn't have the authority to enforce it, though, so it never happened. And a couple weeks later, the protests in Madison failed. Governor Scott Walker found a way to modify his union-busting bill. He passed it without the Democrats. After they took their vote, GOP state senators left the Capitol through an underground tunnel to avoid facing protesters.
4 weeks after announcing his budget repair bill proposal, Governor Walker signed the amended version into law on Friday.
We just had a ceremonial signing. I officially signed Act 11 into law, Act 10 into law this morning at approximately 9:30.
Labor leaders who look back on this moment have different views on how it went down. Some say workers themselves decided what would happen next. What really got the crowds going, they say, weren't calls to strike. They were calls to recall Walker. A recall election was mounted the next year, and the governor was forced to campaign to stay in office. Though he did keep his job, Donald Trump contributed $15,000 to help Walker survive. It's so hard not to wonder how things would have played out differently if workers had gone on strike. One GOP state senator I spoke with, he actually said protests ended up consolidating Republican votes. Like, once they felt cornered, the GOP was resolved to sign this anti-union bill into law no matter what. It's possible a general strike would have made the public feel the same way, turning them against the workers once their garbage sat outside for a few days or nurses refused to show up for shifts. It's possible some contingent of workers would refuse to call out of work at all. They had legitimate concerns that they'd be punished. But it's also possible a general strike could have been the leverage workers needed, and Scott Walker's legislation would have collapsed. It's a small possibility, but it's real. I'm not ignorant of the enormity, perhaps even impossibility, of what I'm proposing. A general strike requires a degree of aggressiveness and coordination I'm not sure exists. Not to mention a strike fund to rival the size of Kamala Harris's $1 billion election fund. Union officials told me that the time for government workers to organize was, frankly, yesterday, and that they'd do well to reach out across sectors and class to involve as broad a group of Americans as possible. Organizers also warned of all the ways the government would try to manipulate and misrepresent what protesters get up to. In Madison, the governor openly mused about sending infiltrators into the occupation to stir up trouble. In court, he claimed the protests were doing millions of dollars of damage to the Capitol building when they were not. Punishment is real, too. In Wisconsin, university doctors who handed out sick notes to teachers so they could call off work got disciplined by their bosses, fined thousands of dollars, put on administrative leave. The punishment this time could be worse. Russ Vought, that same Trump appointee who talked about putting government workers in trauma, has advocated for turning the military on American citizens to control what he calls riots.
We want to be able to shut down the riots and not have the legal community or the defense community to come in and say that's an inappropriate use of what you're trying to do.
Before Trump assumed office last month, before I knew how bad or personal this administration would get for me, I called up journalist Barton Gellman. He's been working with the Brennan Center for Justice to game out what the resistance to Donald Trump might look like.
I don't think it's possible to be fully prepared for an authoritarian wannabe president. The powers of the presidency are so awesome, and the flexibility of the president to do what he wants is so great.
Barton engineered a series of tabletop games with thought leaders and politicians, law professors, but also people like New Jersey's former governor, Christie Todd Whitman. When this group tried to figure out how protests were going to go down, they thought the only thing that would stop troops from firing on civilians was a group of faith leaders in full clerical garb. They essentially dared the soldiers to shoot them first.
If the president doesn't mind breaching longtime norms or even breaking the law, that it's going to be impossible to stop abuse entirely.
If this does not sound appealing, the alternative may sound worse. Over at Foreign Affairs, you can read an article by Stephen Levitsky laying out what happens now. Levitsky wrote a book called How Democracies Die. He calls the path we're on now the path to American authoritarianism. I'm floating this general strike idea for a simple reason. Workers are running out of options. Unions are too. Because if they represent a population of government employees who can be summarily dismissed for political reasons, then who exactly are they protecting anymore? My husband loved being a federal employee. He thought a lot about what he put up in his office to make it feel like his own. There was this triptych of album covers, one red, Ray Charles, one white, that was Elvis, one blue, Joni Mitchell, obviously. And there was an enormous print of Faith Ringgold's painting, known as Freedom of Speech. It's an American flag, inscribed with the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble. The flag is studded with the names of people who have pushed those freedoms to the brink, from Harriet Tubman to the John Birch Society. We're at the brink now, too. But the First Amendment still exists. I think it's time to use it. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. This audio essay was edited by Susan Matthews and produced by Anna Phillips. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky if you'd like. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.